Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Thursday, April 16th, the day after tax day here in the United States, and day 2 or 3 of the U.S. blockade of the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz. You take your pick. There's been all kinds of developments since we last talked, and the big one today, of course, the announcement that was just made, is that separately, Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire. Now we're 9 days or 10 days, however you want to count it, into the 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran, which was supposed to include Lebanon, was announced as including Lebanon. And after that announcement, Trump, of course, spoke about the fact that the Iranian 10-point plan looked workable, and so that he was agreeing to the ceasefire. And then, of course, immediately Israel reneged or, tried to undermine it by making one of the most ferocious attacks on Lebanon to date, killing hundreds of people in a civilian neighborhood that they claim that terrorists are hiding among the civilians. Of course, there's no way to disprove that. But in any case, they claimed, and then the U.S. subsequently tried to claim, that the whole Lebanon issue was a separate issue. Now, let's just remember, to keep this all in perspective, this whole war is about Israeli expansion in the Middle East. That's why it's being fought. Somehow or other, Bibi Netanyahu convinced Trump to do something that even George W. Bush was smart enough not to do, even though he wanted to, 25 years ago or 24 years ago, whatever, that Obama was smart enough not to do, that Biden, or at least the people that were running the administration when Biden was president, they were smart enough not to do, for exactly the reason that we see now, that, everyone has been saying for decades, that if you attack Iran, they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz. There's not a good military way to reopen it, and therefore it's going to be highly costly. Not to mention that in those ensuing decades since the George W. Bush administration, Iran has completely changed the structure of their military. They've decentralized their command system. You have all this, for lack of a better word, federalism as far as commands go, where, regional commanders can operate independently if the supreme leader is killed or cannot contact the troops. So you have that, you have their missile capability, their huge underground networks. They have not tried to develop a nuclear weapon. They've enriched uranium beyond the level needed for energy or medical isotopes. But there's a lot more that goes into having a working nuclear weapon other than just having enough enriched uranium or uranium enriched enough, which it really needs to hit the 80 to 90% level. Iran is enriched to about 60 as a negotiating ploy, as a tactic to try to say, look, you ripped up our nuclear agreement. We're no longer bound by it. Maybe we will go all the way. But they had this fatwa that was prohibiting them from doing so. And they pretty much are still obeying that. And I don't know if I mentioned, I know I posted on social media that it is not a controversial point to say that the Iranians have not been trying to build a nuclear weapon in decades. The intelligence communities published their findings on this. And as of last month, they're still saying, no, they're not trying to build a nuclear weapon. So anything beyond that is, as I said on the last episode, just rhetoric. It's just bullshit to try and justify wars for other reasons. And in this case, mainly for Israeli expansion. Now, whether the empire thinks it would be good to have a little pet empire in the Middle East called Israel that controls most of the territory, I don't know. I don't see how the average American benefits from that, whether it benefits the empire or not. I mean, my position is the empire itself does not benefit the average American. In fact, the average American would be much better off without it and without troops stationed outside our borders for the most part, and without having fought any of the wars in my lifetime. I was born in 65. I used to wear a POW bracelet for one of the POWs, whom was turned out to be very famous, which was an interesting side story I won't go into now. But he actually escaped from Vietnam, or from Vietnam twice, or from his prison camp. He was recaptured and tortured both times, and eventually released. And he wrote a letter to me when he got back home back in the 70s. So it was a great story. And for a long time, I couldn't recall his name because I lost the bracelet. And I finally did figure out who it was. Anyway, so let's catch up on where we are with this completely unnecessary, costly war. So the last time we talked, the U.S. had entered the ceasefire. They had gone to the negotiations. And basically, Trump agreed to the ceasefire and to send representatives to Islamabad, to Pakistan, based on his published statement that the Iranian 10-point plan looked workable. And I broke it down in the last episode. There was no way it was workable. And as expected, the U.S. entered the negotiations with the idea that they were still going to impose the 15-point plan. Now, you remember the 10-point plan by Iran had that they get to keep enriching uranium for their peaceful programs. And J.D. Vance says that virtually all that was discussed there was that the U.S. was sticking with, you can't enrich any uranium anymore at all on your soil, and you have to hand over all of your enriched uranium you have. I mean, that was never going to fly. Why did they bother putting out the statement that the 10-point plan was workable if they had no intention of even considering anything on the 10-point plan? So, I mean, one answer could be they're just buying time. Now, there's all kinds of talk that during this ceasefire, where there haven't been kinetic attacks on Iran by the U.S., that, the U.S. is massing more troops there and, all kinds of activity to get ready for another, big round of warfare, restocking munitions that were depleted, etc. And we'll get to the blockade in a moment. But I mean, we're really going no further. I'm sure Iran is doing the same thing on their side. And one of the problems with, another round of bombing is that there aren't any targets left. I mean, Trump said, okay, well, we'll start hitting your energy plants and civilian infrastructure, bridges, maybe even desalination plants. He doesn't want to do that. If he does do that, it could be, who knows, if other major powers like China and Russia enter the war at that point. I think he probably, part of the reason he agreed to the ceasefire was he gave them this ultimatum and they didn't back down. Well, they're not going to back down again either. And if he does hit their energy infrastructure, they're going to hit the energy infrastructure of the GCC states, and we're going to have a global depression, maybe worse than the 1930s. So there's really no good exit still. Now, the propaganda machine is on high energy, high test with this blockade, as if it were some, stroke of genius idea that no one thought of before. Maybe we could blockade the strait. Now, remember, basically what the Iranians were doing is blockading the strait and only letting traffic through that they wanted to go through. And that would include Chinese ships carrying Iranian oil. All right. So, and by the way, one thing you should understand, like 90% of all Iran's oil exports go to China. I mean, part of that reason for that is the sanctions, and China doesn't recognize the sanctions. The sanctions have been lifted, by the way, right now to try to get the oil price down, which spiked up as a result of this war. But the U.S. responded by saying, well, we're going to blockade the strait so that even the ships you want to get through, and especially those that that are carrying your oil exports, we're going to make sure they don't get through and we're going to choke you off. Okay. So this doesn't make things better for Americans. All right. That means that whereas when only Iran was blockading the strait, far less oil was coming out of the Middle East. Now, if the U.S. were going to be serious about this, almost no oil would be coming out of the Middle East, out of the Persian Gulf. Now, in reality, Chinese ships have sailed right past the blockade. Thank goodness that the U.S. hasn't tried to stop them, board them, God forbid, sink them, because then we would be in a war with the next most powerful nation in the world, who is, by the way, nuclear armed and friendlier with the other nuclear armed behemoth, Russia, friendlier than ever with them. So what does that really mean then? So what is the blockade doing? If Iran, 90% of Iran's oil exports are getting through, and Iran is still choking off any U.S. or Israeli ships, and also, limiting the amount of other ships that can go through based on whether they consider them hostile, cooperating with the U.S. and Israel, etc. They've let a few European ships go through, but traffic is still way down. So, none of this is making things better. And I think the Iranians are willing to wait. I mean, again, as I said last time, the Trump administration has put them in a situation where they have nothing to lose. There's nothing more to bomb except, going to that point that I mentioned. And, the U.S. can go bomb the same military sites again. I'm taking the U.S.'s word, they're destroyed. So Iran's military capability, to the extent they haven't rebuilt some surface sites, is mainly underground. It can't be reached by U.S. bombers. It's still capable of launching missiles. Nothing's really changed. And there's still no way out of this war. And don't forget, we heard all this about the president's prerogatives in the first few weeks of the war, that he doesn't need to ask Congress. Well, now it's like almost 2 months. It's 6, 7 weeks into the war, which started on February 28th, all of March, half of April, and still no appeal to Congress for permission to keep going with this. So completely the first day was unconstitutional. Okay, the only thing the president can do is respond to an attack, a live attack, and defend the country while it's being attacked until he can get a declaration of war. Okay, there's no dispute about this. Everything the administration says is just complete horseshit. FDR went and asked Congress for a declaration of war while the Japanese were on Wake Island and other islands engaged with U.S. troops fighting. They eventually killed all the troops on Wake Island, did the Japanese. But still, while that was going on, Franklin Roosevelt understood he needed to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Again, and to just cut through some more bullshit words, not notify Congress of something, ask permission of Congress to do something. That's what a declaration of war is for the president. So this is all unconstitutional. It's very harmful to Americans. Now, in the last few days, and I don't like to put too much weight on this, markets seem to have treated the blockade as if it's going to do something, which is really counterintuitive because it's just decreasing the supply of oil even more. Well, it's not really, but it would be. markets never really went down that hard during the war. Equities markets, oil is another story, but we'll talk about that in a second. And they didn't go up that much, after the blockade started. I think investors are still sitting around trying to figure out, what does this mean? I'm just looking at the equities markets. They're pretty much flat today. Over the 7,000 mark for the S&P, that's a significant psychological barrier. Under 50,000 for the Dow. So we can't blame Pam Bondi anymore. She's canned. So this has got to be somebody else's fault. And then let's look at oil. Now, oil was way down. It's below 100, but just barely for Brent crude. Crude oil is at 91.52. That's significantly down from the highs it's been at. It's up almost 4% today, almost 5% for Brent crude. So the oil markets might start to be figuring out that the Trump administration propaganda is just that. So, the oil definitely went down. Now, Trump has been out there, and my exposure to cable news is limited. I only see clips when they're shared on social media because I canceled cable in June 2020, almost 6 years ago, as you should, by the way, because even if you don't watch them, your money is still going to them as long as you have a cable subscription. But in any case, Trump claimed that China has thanked him or will thank him. He's very tricky with his language because, quote, we're opening the Strait of Hormuz. We're opening. So it's not open. And somehow he's trying to spin this blockade as if it's going to open the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, it is not. The Chinese have issued no statements remotely positive about anything that Trump or the administration is doing. They've condemned the entire war as dangerous and irresponsible. They said they violated Iran's sovereignty. They're against the U.S. and the UN on this war. There's nothing about this. Trump at one point said, President Xi will hug me when I see him. And again, they're trying to spin this. The idea that they're saying we're opening the strait. So they've done nothing to open the strait. And then, of course, they don't say they've opened it because you can't sail a U.S. ship through it or it'll get sunk. Okay? That's the situation as of today. So nothing is opened. Nothing is being opened. Now, they're trying to get another set of negotiations, and I don't know what that's about, if this is all for show, if they're going to approach these differently, because frankly, if I were Iran, I wouldn't go to any more negotiations until the U.S. assured me, if I'm Iran, that they've dropped this idea about no enrichment. That it's a non-starter. Okay, they're never going to give that up. So we'll see. We have to see what happens. We have to see what happens on Tuesday or Wednesday. Now, I'm sure there might be more stalling by Trump as the deadline approaches. So I don't know if that's Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock or Wednesday at 8 o'clock or Wednesday morning, whatever it is that the ceasefire ends. Sometime before that, we'll be hearing, more all caps, multiple exclamation point truths, as they're called, from Trump. And who knows what the next angle is going to be. But in my book, nothing has changed. Basically, the U.S. has gotten bamboozled into this war by the Israelis. They don't want it to end. They will continue to try to undermine any negotiated settlement, even a damaging one to the United States, or even a damaging one to Iran. They don't want any settlement. They want to acquire territory. And to do that, they've got to get Iran out of the way. They either have to put in regime change and put in a regime that's basically a U.S.-Israel puppet, or they have to wreck Iran the way they did Libya and Syria and Iraq and all those other countries, so that they're just not capable of opposing Israel's territorial expansion. That's what this is about. And no one should make any mistake about that. And I generally don't get the anti-Semite whatever comments, but I'll say it just for the disclaimer's sake. And this is nothing about the Israelis being Jewish. This is about the Israelis being a powerful, nuclear-armed, modern secular state that's acting like any other in a region where it wants to be the regional hegemon. That's what's going on. And the fact that it can get the U.S. to fight its wars and back it up like this, any country, whether they were French or German or Chinese or Brazilian, any country would do the same thing if the most powerful country in the world was dumb enough to let itself get dragged into these wars for it. They'd all do it. So it has nothing to do with being Jewish. And the reason the U.S., as far as I can tell, is willing to do this is because there's so many lunatic Christians who believe this has something to do with the end of the world. And I've said plenty about that before. So it's not even the Jews in America who are the problem. Yeah, a few rich ones give a lot of money towards this, but their money is only effective politically because it can sway the votes of tens of millions of absolutely lunatic, out of their minds Christians who apparently think that Christianity is limited to the book of Revelations and that every word of that book is to be taken literally, like all the events are going to happen as they're described in the book with the four guys on the horses and the whole 9 yards. No, it's not symbolic. I'm sure some of them might say, well, it's symbolic, but having the Jews in charge of Israel is part of the prophecy. So we have to make sure, see, the part where we have to make sure that happens, that's the part that's nutty to me. So if this is God's divine plan, then why would he need the U.S. to fight wars against Iranians? It's completely idiotic. But I'm telling you, I think I can't find another reason why the U.S. government is so interested in this. Because as far as I can tell, the only U.S. interests about the Middle East is that oil keeps coming out of the region. And again, the fact that the U.S. is an exporter of oil doesn't change that, okay? Because the oil prices Americans pay are based on the global supply. Whether or not that specific oil comes to the United States, it still affects the price American importers pay. Because if that oil supply were decreased, even for others, they will compete with U.S. importers for the oil that's left over, for the other oil, for the oil we do import. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind because almost every day, Trump makes the idiotic statement that we don't really care about oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. We don't import it. That's for other people. We're doing this for other people, for Europe and for India and other countries that do import a lot. Now, China imports most of Iran's, but don't forget, this is affecting other Persian Gulf countries' exports as well. So about 12% of the world's supply of oil comes through that strait, through the Strait of Hormuz, out of the Persian Gulf. And were that supply to be interrupted indefinitely, that would spike oil prices for everybody in the world who consumes oil, not just for those who get the specific oil coming out of the Gulf. So that's really important to remember. And there's one other thing. I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic and there weren't many lives lost because of this, but this is the second time now Trump has tried to pull this, and I shouldn't say Trump, it's the empire has tried to pull, because the first one was mainly Obama and Biden. But this idea that the empire starts a war, ends up losing it, and then tries to walk away saying, well, this was never our problem. This is more Europe's problem. They've done it to the Europeans twice. I mean, again, the U.S. started the Ukraine war. Okay, if we're not on the same page on that, we just can't be friends. The U.S. overthrew their government, put in a puppet who tried to take away Russia's port at Sevastopol. And I'm talking like right away. That was almost the first thing he did. to which Putin responded by annexing Crimea. And then when the civil war erupted, because they overthrew the government that was elected by the country, and a Russian-speaking president, they replaced him with somebody who started to bomb the eastern provinces for trying to secede. And during the Biden administration, it's very clear Zelensky was green lighted to just shell civilian neighborhoods, and that's what caused the invasion. Okay, so no one fired on Russia, but this is what they did on Russia's border. And meanwhile, all the time talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO, drilling NATO troops, doing exercises on Ukrainian territory. Okay, so that's when I say that they started the war, not to mention the decades-long expansion of NATO towards Russia's border after promising not to do that to get Gorbachev to agree to the unification of Germany, reunification. So anyway, they start this war in Ukraine, and now Trump's like, oh, this is not really our problem. And the great thing is that he goes in there trying to negotiate like he's some disinterested third party. Hey, we're just trying to make peace. Boy, these two adversaries are so unreasonable, as if the U.S. was not a party to the war, which it is. And it's lost. It fought a proxy war against Russia, and it lost, even with all that hundreds of billions sent there, and all of Europe and NATO, is mostly the United States, supporting Ukraine. They still lost. And now they don't want to admit they lost, so they're going to walk away. It's great. And now they're trying to do the same thing in Iran. Like, they start this war, Iran closes the strait just like, everyone said they would for decades. And then they try to say, well, the strait's not really our problem. We're just, that's up to Europe to open it back up. So you can't knock them for chutzpah, to use a very appropriate word. But geez, again, we have to remember, I shouldn't laugh, that there's hundreds of thousands dead in Ukraine and on the Russian side in one war they've started, not that many yet for Iran. Let's hope it doesn't get there. But I don't see that we're anywhere near a resolution. They're going to start, so the ceasefire ends Tuesday or Wednesday, barring another, stalling by Trump. And I don't know. The U.S. starts bombing already bombed targets again. Does it escalate to the power plants and then cause the depression? Hard to say. We'll see. My hunch, that and a quarter will get you a phone call if there were still payphones. My hunch is that the U.S. will either stall or go on bombing targets they already bombed, just so they can say they're doing something, and then try to think of something else and keep the blockade going. That's not really a blockade, because all the ships that Iran cares about getting out of the area, or most of the ships they care about, are sailing right by. Thankfully, because we'd be in World War III if they weren't. And by that, I mean Chinese ships carrying Iranian oil to China. So all this is very dangerous, obviously. No one knows what this administration is going to do. And we can only hope. I do think in the back of his mind, Trump actually has some good instincts. He ignored those instincts in starting this war. He got talked into the idea that if they decapitated the Iranian regime, that together with the massive bombing campaign, and the Iranians would just surrender, and they didn't. And now he's in a war of attrition, and the Iranians, I don't know if you remember one of the Matrix movies, basically Neo, I think he's talking to the architect, or he might be talking to the Smith character, I'm not sure. And basically, I think it's the architect is saying they're going to destroy humanity. And if you remember, the machines were being powered by humans, in little tanks. And Neo responds, well, you need us to survive. And the answer the architect gives is, there are levels of survival to which we're willing to go. So in other words, they're willing to go to this very low level of survival, the machines are, in order to get rid of the humans. And I think we've put Iran in that position. Their country is already wrecked above the ground, and they've got nothing to lose, and they can't keep doing this for the rest of their history. So they're willing to go keep bombing us. Go ahead. You want to bomb our energy infrastructure? We'll take the whole world economy down with us. We don't care. That's where they're at. I mean, you could say that's crazy, but again, they don't have good alternatives. What's their alternative? To agree to lay down prostrate in front of Israel with no missile defense and no chance of ever doing it? They can't do it. So they don't have another. This is their best choice. They're actually acting very rationally. Whether you like them or not, I don't like them from what I know about them. I am these days discounting, how bad the Iranians are, Bashar al-Assad was, Putin is. Again, I don't think these people are angels, but hearing the same bullshit for the regime to justify yet another war they promised not to do, Trump promised never to do. And it's always, oh, look at how, inhumane they are to their own people. Look at how authoritarian they are. Okay, I'm not taking your word for it. All right. I am sure, again, that the Iranians are authoritarian and they are nutty religious fanatics too. I mean, they're not willing to go bomb other countries because they think it'll help the end of the world come around better. All right. So who's the nuttier one? But, they have this theocracy that imposes all kinds of religious restrictions on their people that I would consider again, I assume that most of that is true. Okay. And that they would, therefore, I would not agree with the way they govern their country. But the last thing I should say is the idea that it's only a very small minority oppressing a large majority on this is obviously untrue, because the revolution they said was going to happen after the regime was decapitated didn't happen. Okay. The truth is that, and it's the same thing I tell my fellow libertarians, it's very similar. The truth is that a large percentage, maybe a majority of Iranians support the mullahs. They want the kind of government the mullahs impose on them. And surveys of Muslims worldwide seem to confirm this, that Sharia law, or whatever the version in Iran is, that's something they want to live under. I don't agree with that, but it's none of my business, really. And it's not for me to, go and fight a war against these people unless they commit an act of a war against the United States, which they haven't. So the reason it's similar for libertarians is, a lot of libertarians think that there's this huge mass of people who want to be freer than they are and want a much smaller, more limited government. And there isn't. I'm sorry. I wish there was. If there was, we would get a government more like that. The truth is that the vast majority of Americans want the government as big as it is. They want it doing even more. All those polls about the approval rating for Congress will come in like Congress has a 6% approval rating. That's not because the government's doing too much. That's because it's not doing enough for those people, that 94% who don't approve of it. They want it to do. Now, each little group wants it to do something for them. Okay. And it might oppose something it's doing for somebody else, but nobody wants anything cut. Nobody wants the government reined in. We're a very small percentage, and that's a reality that people don't want to swallow. And the only thing we can do is try to persuade people what's best for them, which actually would be a libertarian society like we had in the 19th century, much closer to a libertarian society. No, it wasn't perfect, but yet a government spending 3% of GDP. Okay. Today it's like 30. And when you put all the governments in, it's well over 40. So percent, like a half, you know. What Thomas Paine said in Common Sense, before he became a French politician and went socialist, that the purpose of government is that we give up a small percentage of our property for preservation of the rest, not half. Okay. So anyway, off the subject, but it's analogous. Most people support the mullahs, and you know what? They were somewhat divided before the war. Now they're in lockstep. When an external force comes and makes war on a population, they tend to rally behind the leader. I mean, hell, they rallied around the chimp, George W. Bush. If anyone could rally around him, believe me, they can rally around the mullahs, who they like a lot better. And just like Cuba, when they're rattling their saber at Cuba now, that's the reason that the communist government is still there, because there's troops on their border, actually within their borders. It's a lease. And there's been all this, external sanctions and embargoes and hostility, and that has rallied the population around the communist government. There's only two real communist governments left in the world, Cuba and North Korea. And what do they both have in common? Thousands of U.S. troops on their border and nonstop hostility by the U.S. towards them. So think it over. Let's see what happens early next week, over the weekend. Hopefully there'll be another set of talks that delays any more bloodshed, but I think we're a long way from over. I hope I'm wrong. Hey, if you found any of this interesting and you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to this podcast. And we have a video version as well that's starting to gain a little momentum. It's still well below the audio version, but you can go to our YouTube channel at Tom Mullen Talks Freedom, or of course, the podcast is on Apple, Stitcher, Google Play, all the podcast platforms. Make sure that you subscribe so you know when there's a new episode. And do me the favor of sharing it with a friend. If everybody shared it with one friend, we'd have twice as many people in theory. And also sign up on my email list. You can get a free copy of my book, It's the Fed Stupid. That book is a few years old now. It was written during the aftermath of the COVID fiasco. And I thought, is this a good book? Is it still relevant? I don't know. And I started skimming it, and hey, I really liked it. So I think you will too. Go to itsthefedstupid.com. You get on my email list. You get a free copy of that book, and you get some more free content a couple times a week. So hope to see you all again. We'll see you at least by early next week, if not before, here on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Thanks for listening.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.